All right, I think it's time. So, I hope you're here for Vue and Vuex, otherwise you're in the wrong room. So, my name is Christoffer Noring. I am Swedish, so if you got any questions, feel free to ask those in Swedish as well as English. Interrupt me whenever you feel like it. How many of you have tried Vue.js? How many use it in production? Okay, that's less hands. So a lot of you are probably enthusiasts, right? Vue.js is great, but at work I'm using something else. Probably React? Angular? Right. Vue.js is super popular. I think you know that, right? I mean, it came out of nowhere. It became as popular as React, and I think it has even passed it. So if I get some numbers wrong here, I know they're wrong, because Vue is even more popular than that. I work for Microsoft. I'm also a Google developer expert. I got a Twitter tag if any of you use Twitter. So if you got any questions afterwards, because you can't think of it right now, I'm very happy to answer those on Twitter. Welcome. Right. As I say, I got some numbers wrong here, but I think you get the main idea. Vue.js is super popular. I think it has even passed React now on GitHub. And as you can see, Angular is there as well. So Vue, React, or Angular are still three very good options. So interest is there. The adaptation isn't quite there. But as we know with everything front-end, that thing can change over 6 months, right? It could be super big by then. So let's talk about the basics. I saw roughly around 5 or 10 hands that tested Vue.js, so I guess the rest of you wants to know what this is about. How hard is this? And why should I care? In my book, I have a history of going from AngularJS to Angular 2 to trying out React and Vue, because I think it's important to have a somewhat of a grasp of everything, right? From then on, I can choose whatever hammer I'm using to whatever nail. Am I right? We should always be in a situation where we're kind of educated. No one's asking us to be an expert. So let's talk about the basics. Let's start with a DOM. Now, so this kind of shows the simplicity of Vue, especially when you're new, especially when you're trying it out for the first time. As you can see above here, we're looking at a body tag and a div. And this div has an ID property in it with an app. We have seen this before if we tried out React or whatever other framework we have. But just like when we were trying out AngularJS, if we ever tried that, we could just start with Vue with a simple script tag, right? This simple script tag enables us to leverage Vue, and let's see some code based on that. So this is what we need for a bare minimum hello world application. We just need to instantiate the Vue object, and we need to provide that constructor with some kind of configuration. So that configuration needs to have the element. That's the first property. That's the element in the former HTML page I was showing you whose content we're going to replace, right? So we are targeting a specific element in the DOM and say you are going to be the Vue application. After that, we give it a data property. Now, so the data property simply means this is the data that you have access to, and you can render that inside of your HTML template. That's not much to look at, but we are up and running, and we feel that we have a Vue application. This is important for me, at least, when I'm starting out anything. I just want stuff to run, right? I don't want to have to do a lot of Webpack config or whatever it is. I want an easy start. If I want to configure later, if I want to do it more advanced later, fine. But it should be easy for me to start. So what did we do, just in retrospect here? We instantiated a component by instantiating the Vue, and we provided it with an object definition, and then we used interpolation, the curly braces, to show our data, right? That wasn't much to look at, but that's the bare minimum, and that's up and running. So let's talk about some kind of structural directives here, right? Because Vue has a lot of similarities with AngularJS. How many have tried out AngularJS at some point? A lot of you is going to understand what I'm saying right now, which is good, right? Vue is different, but it's still similar. So you can use a lot of that knowledge to say, I recognize this. My brain is actually not that old. So we have structured directives. We have these instructions in Vue that we put inside the template that enables us to use Boolean logic, and it enables us to use things like v-for and just render out a list. We recognize this. So inside the Vue now, we go back to the data property, and we this time give it an items inside of that data and say items is of type list. I think we see where this one is going, but let's follow this thought. So simply by inside of our template do a v-for, we can simply say, yeah, okay, repeat this list, item in items, and off you go, right? This is not really that complicated. And for now, we have this mental model. Okay, is there an actual difference to Angular? Angular 1, right? So conditional rendering. For that, we have a v-if and a v-else. That enables us to say if something is truthy, render. If not, don't render, or render something else. Simply used like this. Inside of our div, we just provide it with a v-if, and we say if it's truthy, render this thing. If it's not, then render this piece of the content. This is quite basic stuff, right? I'm just showing you the basic construct. There's a lot of content inside of this talk, so hopefully you feel like you need a few cups of coffee after this, right? So form controls. There is no application alive, I think, that doesn't contain some kind of form, some kind of data collection. If I'm not showing you that, I'm not actually showing you anything valuable. So let's talk about input elements. Input elements is the way that we collect data, right? Especially if they're of type text, or radio button, or checkboxes. So here we simply create this new item property inside of our data, and we're able to bind that to the input. So every time we try to hit something in the input, our new item in this case gets updated. Pretty basic, but we like basic at this point, right? Checkbox. As simple. We use the V model once again, and we just look at this Boolean property inside of the data, and it works, right? That's what we want. We want simplicity. But of course, we also want to deal with list of checkboxes. And in that case, can do that. In this case, we can just bind it to an array instead. So if everyone's looking at the same array, in this case called checkturtles, every time we do something, this array will have stuff added to it or removed to it, depending on if we're clicking inside of it or trying to check out, right? Because we're dealing with things of type checkbox. So every time we have this list, we click in it, the array gets populated. Same thing with radio buttons, pretty much, right? So in this case, everyone's looking at the same V model. Basic stuff, but it's important. So we can also capture what happens inside of a select with a V model once again, so it's very consistent. As you can see, we just repeat out the options here with the v-for. Pretty simple. We add the V model inside of the select, and that's pretty much it. It shouldn't be harder than this, right? You with me? You're fed properly, right? Caffeine in your blood. Good. Okay, so what about methods? We need methods. So methods is a separate property. So the data property was for data. That makes sense. Methods is for methods. Big whoop, right? So the methods property here, this is an object in which we define X number of properties, and all of those properties inside of methods is a method that we can invoke in the template. So in this case, we have a save method. It does something very simple at this point, just a simple console log. But as you can see here, we are context aware of this. So this simply means it's a shorthand for data, right? So when we do this new item, it's the same thing as typing this.data.new item, but you know that's a bit long, so it gives us a shorthand. So we learned the basics. Are we a Vue ninja at this point? Well, we can at least create a to-do application, and that's fun, right? To-do applications are the new hello world. We want to learn more. I have a theme in this presentation. I'm not sure you've seen it already, right? We know this guy. His name is Sensei? I think it's Splinter, right? Yeah. Master Splinter. Good one. Thank you. So let's talk about components. Every single framework today that is anybody has components. If you don't have components, you're not in the picture anymore. Am I right? React has components, Angular has components, and Vue has components. Okay, there are different ways of creating components. I'm going to show you the first version, the first flavor. This is creating a global component. There is another type of component that we create using the CLI. I will show that too. So first off, we use the view, the global view, and call component, and inside of there we give it 2 arguments, one being the component name, the other one is the component definition. So the component definition looks very, very similar to the Vue app we were creating before. So that thing is going to have a data property and a methods property and so on. And let's have a look at an example. So here we have a Vue component. It has a name product. It comes with a template property. So this is simply HTML and some directives in which you say, well, here's an input and here's a button and some methods that I hook up, right? And then I got the data property, which contains my data, big surprise, and methods. There isn't much to this, but this is the basic structure. So template, data, and methods. Those are the most common ones that you're going to keep on using over and over again. Okay. I've held a similar talk once before, and I called this the Babushka model. I'm very sorry for being wrong. It's called the Matryoshka model. A lot of Russians know this, and they told me on YouTube. That's fun, right? I learn stuff every day. So this is a Russian doll, pretty much, right? I mean, this is every application that you create out there. You're never going to have one component. You're going to have a component within a component within a component till you're out of air. That's your application. So let's look at a component within a component, just one step. So here we have a parent. We have a child. And inside of the parent, we have a child, just like a kangaroo, right? So as you can see here inside of the parent at the top, we are rendering the child component. And the child component is pretty simple. It just renders out some static text. And that's pretty much what we need to do if we are in a global context, and everything works fine. But now I'm going to take you over to the CLI instead, because most likely that's how you're going to be creating Vue applications. CLIs are great, right? It enables us to run tests. It enables us to scaffold components and so on. So use the CLI. I know it's very tempting to, based on my example, to just use a script tag and go wild and crazy Vue. But if you're in an enterprise environment, you want to use a CLI. So the idea with the CLI is that you have a certain structure to your application, and that usually means that you have one file per component. You can have several components, but it's not really recommended. So, okay, what does that mean? How does this file look? Well, it has 3 parts. It has the template tag instead of the template property. It has a script tag, and it has a style tag. So template tag is what we expect. It's the markup. Script tag is simply the component definition, and the style tag is simply our style. Looking at an example, it looks like this. At the top, you got the template with HTML and whatever else, right? Then you got the script tag. So instead of calling Vue component, we simply export this default-looking object. But as you can see, it looks the same, right? It has this name property, the data property, and so on. And at the bottom here, you can see style. It has a very interesting attribute. That attribute is called scoped. And that means that our CSS is going to be contained within inside of our component. We've all had this CSS that's bleeding, right? We've changed over here, and suddenly whatever toast component we have, it looks like shit. Is this recorded? So no CSS leakage, and yes, that's a good thing, right? So what about child components? I showed you the parent and child thing already, right? But there is a little addition that you need to do inside of the CLI to still make that work. And that's what I said, it's a tiny bit different, but not a lot. So what you need to do to use a child component inside the CLI is to import it, firstly, right? So once you imported that child component that you want to use inside of the parent, you need to tell the parent about it. So you need to register it with the parent and say, you know what this is, so you know how this should be rendered. So it looks like this. We're inside of the parent component. First thing we do here at the top is to import the child component. And then we got a property inside of the component definition called components. This is where we tell the parent that you know what this child is, render it for me, please. then we're free to use it. Then this will actually work. When we have this test, which is the child component, and we just said it, right? If we don't do this correctly, then we just have a test thing inside of our browser, and we're not very happy about it. Okay, input and output. There's never going to be a component ever that's not going to be relying on inputs and outputs, right? Most of the components we create is going to have input in form of data and output in the form of events, right? They bubble upwards. So this is the way we do it. We use a structural directive called vbind. That's the long version. There is a shorthand version of writing vbind, so you don't have to actually type that many characters. But for now, we're going to use the long one. So vbind. Vbind simply means that here's an input property, and above you can see the component that I'm defining, and what it says inside of a props is what input property I have. So props here say, I have an input property called item, which means that someone can bind to this item, and once I get an item, then inside of the template here, I can write item.name. And that's how I go from input property to actually showing it. What about validation? How many here are coding React applications? You know prop types, right? What I'm about to tell you is very similar to prop types if you want a mental model of what I'm trying to show. Yeah, so we can specify validation on different levels. It's kind of advanced, actually, the validation inside of Vue. So you can start with something simple, like this. So you can say inside of props, for every property, year, for example, is an input property, and we say it's of type number. Or we say that title is of type string. So why does that matter? Well, if you try to bind something to it that is the wrong type, it's not going to throw an exception, but it's going to give you a warning in the developer tools. So you're going to be able to see that, nah, you're up to no good. We can do this better, right? So not only type, but we can say required as well. So now we can have it say, not only are you the wrong type, you're actually missing altogether. Okay, so that's a little bit better validation. I showed you type, and now I'm showing you type and required, but we can do it even better. So if someone is actually omitting this property altogether, someone else, it could be you after 2 weeks vacation, or it could be your colleague. They're trying to use your component, and they're using it wrong. You can actually mitigate this. You can say, well, if you omit this property that I need you to have, you can actually respond with a default function that, at the end of the day, returns something that fixes it. So in this case, we are returning a default product. So this is a component with like a product detail, right? Whose job in life is to show a product. I mean, it's really up to you if you want to create this component and say, you omitted something of type product, and therefore I can't even render. But if you provide this default function, then you can at least show them that like unknown product or product is missing. And that's going to give a good hint to the developer that something is wrong, right? Or they can actually read your code and say, well, I'm doing it wrong. Okay, so here is a prop tip. We don't actually have to use vbind. As I say, vbind was the long version. You can just suffice with colon. Great, right? So instead of writing vbind colon product, we can just type colon product. We like to be lazy because we are developers, right? Everything that can be scripted should be scripted. And hopefully it is scripted as well, right? So what you are looking at here is 2 scenarios in which we run product detail. In the first scenario, everything is good because we give it the product, right? We have colon product equals a product, everybody's happy. But the second scenario will also work because remember, we had this validation with the default function. So in this case, it's actually fine with us omitting it. Make sense? Great, still awake. Victory. We can also have a validator function for those more complex objects. We can actually do a comparison like this, where we say the value is wrong, or we can say a pattern matching with a regex, right? So we can take this as far as we need to, because sometimes we've got a very complex type coming in, and we just need to give it a validator function. Now that thing can go bananas. Here we see different scenarios. We see that we set an age property here to 11, and we're trying to send that inside of the product detail. And yeah, validation kicks in, right? Because remember our validation function that said, I'm only okay with this if you're above 18 or whatever, right? So in the first case here, it's going to say, no good, because you provide 11. In the next case, you see that the age value is different, and it's all good. So that's how you can test it, that it works. What about output? Well, let's start by talking about the parent. So here we have a parent component, and inside of its template, it pretty much just only renders the product detail component, and that thing has a property on it of type product. And as you can see here inside of data, that we have a product that is there. Okay, we also have a method called handle save. Now I've shown you a bit shortcut here. I'm not sure whether I said that, but normally when you bind events, you use the V on. But as with everything else in Vue, we can write it shorter. As we did with vbind, we could do like a colon, right? Same thing with v on and events. We can just do @save instead of v on save. So you're going to see a lot of Vue code out there who's just using these shorthands, and so that's why I wanted to show you both, so you can actually read the code, right? Okay. So we're taking the function from the parent and providing it to the child, which means that we expect the child at some point in its lifetime to invoke this method that we provided on save. So the child component here. Child component says, okay. I have a props of type item. I think it should be product. I'm mistyping this, but you get the idea, right? We have an input property that we recognize in the form of props, but we also have something very interesting happen when we invoke the button, right? We click the button, and we use the v on click, but instead of just invoking that method, it looks a bit different, but it looks the same whenever you try to invoke any kind of method. So what we're calling is $emit. And then we say $emit save, which is the name of the property that the method has. But we also give it a second argument, which is the payload. So not only do we invoke save, but we say, here's some data for you as well. And this is going to be invoked, which means that it's going to go back to the parent, and the parent's going to say, aha, I was invoked. Oh, here's some data too. So when this returns back to the parent have the ability to look at this some data and do something with it. This is a very common scenario. Our common scenario is that we have a product that we try to edit locally. So usually we have a scenario that starts out with a product list, right? We have X number of products listed in a list. We have probably selected one of those products, and we opt on trying to edit a specific product. It's a very common scenario, right? A typical to-do list. So imagine that you've mistyped something in that to-do list. You want to go to an item and say, well, I want to change your name, and then I want to press save, and there's probably some backend call in there, right? It goes to the database and say, persist this. So that's the scenario we have. But it also means one other thing. So normally with JavaScript, everything is references, right? So when we pass a reference to that product, we don't want that product to change all the time while we're editing, so we want to disconnect. Right? If we're inside of a product detail and try to change the title or description or whatever we're changing, we want to disconnect. We don't want to tell the parent until we're done. Only then. So here's the parent, right? As I say, the scenario is to have a product list. Inside of that product list, we have the ability to select a product in that product list, but we also have some kind of product detail component who's going to show the selected product. That makes sense, right? A list and some kind of detail view. So I select something in the list, the detail view is being populated. Okay? So as you can see, the select method in this code is that we select the product, and that means that the property selected product gets set, and the product detail should hopefully render the right product, right? Yes, and we also see that we have a save method that we are yet to use, but the save method is something that we're going to pass to the child, the product detail. We can actually see that inside of the product detail here in the template, right? Because product detail takes two things, one being the product and the other one is the method. We can see that with the @save. Okay, as I say, there needs to be a disconnect. Otherwise, it's going to treat it as a reference, and we're going to start changing in the child, and the parent's going to say, yep, I saw that character, and that character, and that character. And that's bad, right? Because we want to do some local changes. We might even want to press cancel at some point and say, oh, no, I didn't mean it. So that's why we need to have a disconnect. And the disconnect happens inside of this data property here, because what we do inside of the child component here is to simply say, we're going to copy all your values, right? ... we're going to copy all your values. So you're working on a copy. You're not working on the actual thing. And that's good, because now we can edit locally, right? We have a turtle here who's sad. He's trying to do a no selection. It doesn't work. He actually doesn't see a new item in the product detail. He sees the same old product detail thing that he selected the first time. And that's not good. So let's have a look at the parent again, see why this is, right? We look at this. Oh, okay, we have a product list, we have a button, we have a product detail. So our conclusion here is that we need some kind of listener. We need some kind of listener that say we actually have a change that happened, right? When we select a product and then opt to select another product, we have some kind of change, right? We need to listen to a change. So we can use a watch property inside of our child component. So the watch property simply say, well, you know this input property. If it changes, then you should do something. So the watch property says that if you do the first selection of your product, then the watch is going to say, something new here, let's copy those values, right, and show that in the product detail. Next time you do a selection, the watch is going to be triggered again, and then it's going to say, new product. Guys, we have something to do. We need to copy this product again, and then we show it. So that's how we fix the problem. And that's how we have these guys dancing, right? So don't forget about the watch property when you have a scenario like this. That's what I'm saying. We feel more ready than ever, right? We had a little more advanced scenario, even though it was a common scenario, and we think we kind of get all the basics of Vue. But there is more. There's always more. Because, well, even though we call it a single-page application, you don't want one page, right? You want more than one page. But not a server-side rendered page. That's the difference, right? We still have some router. So we're going to talk about routing. So routing in Vue is very, very simple. It's as simple as it should be. There are frameworks out there, no frameworks mentioned, but routers have been in different versions, and they have been less good. I think a lot of big frameworks right now are guilty of that. So what do we need for the routing to work? We need to define a routes array, right? We need some kind of dictionary that says, well, products should be handled by product component, about should be handled by about component, a product details route should be handled by product detail. You get the idea, right? We also need to define a viewport, that place inside of our template that's going to be switched. And lastly, we need to tell the Vue application about this. Here's your routes. Put them inside of there and make them work. I don't care how, but make them work. So we define our routes array like this. And as you see, we got X number of entries, one for each path that we want to support. So path products is being rendered by products component. Treasure path is being handled by the treasure component, and so on. Pretty simple stuff. But as I say, we need to take these routes and give them to a Vue router. So once the Vue router has it, the Vue router is set up, but we haven't told the Vue application yet. So that's the last step we need to do in the config. Yes, we need to talk about viewports. That place in the template that actually gets switched out. So here you see a viewport, right? The router outlet element. What we say, we have a template. This part of the application should be switched. The other parts are static. So typical static areas are menus, right, and footers. And we got something in the middle that just is being replaced. That's how we usually approach this. So how do we navigate? We need to define some kind of link, right? We have the element router link to help us with that when we simply populate the to property with a path. Here we say, click on me, and I'm going to handle this to make it sure it looks good in the browser. So that's how we navigate with an element. What about wildcards, right? I mean, when I'm saying wildcards, what do I mean? I mean, typically, we have this product list, right? We have clicked a certain product. We want a separate route for the product detail. That's what I mean by wildcard. And when I say wildcard, I mean I don't know beforehand what the ID property has going to have for value. So I'm doing like a pattern matching that says, regardless if you do product/1 or product/144, it's the same pattern, right? So for that reason, I add a wildcard, and you can easily see it's a wildcard by the colon ID. And as you can see, it's being handled by a product detail. So how do we access that? First off, the wildcard I created here is going to match a pattern, right? It's not going to match exactly products. But products 11, products 114, products 10,000 should all be matched. Okay, so looking at this, we can easily access the parameter, right? We want to access this parameter because most likely we need to go to backend, some kind of endpoint that says, well, you know this product with ID 1, go to the database and get some more details. That's usually the scenario we have, right? Because we want to know title and description and a lot of other meta information. In this case, we have a static products list, but most likely you have some kind of AJAX call here, right? Going to the endpoint and say, find me this product. So that's how you would handle that, by $router.params.id. That's how you access it. What about query parameters? Let's talk about why we have query parameters, right? Because we talked about router parameters first. So query parameters is everything that happens after the question mark. And those are usually used to filter data collection. We say that, well, if I actually do select star from products, I might be in for a very painful ride. And why? Because that data set might be enormous. This might be some large e-commerce site of 10,000 products, and suddenly your application is like, woo, right? So we need to filter that collection. Not only is that response very big, but you want to provide it with page size and maybe page and some other properties. And you can easily do this by writing like that. And of course, we access those query parameters by using $route.query.query param, and query param is simply the name. So imagine that the query param is instead called page size, or whatever you call that parameter. So used like this. So here we can see that we are actively using the query.page and query.page size and so on, right? So we have the ability to say, go and fetch me products, but filter the collection a bit, right? Give me something usable that I can actually render, that doesn't take 2 years to render. Okay, we're dealing with users. Most users will never see a URL. Most users won't care about the URL, right? But some of these users, they're going to be like, URL, I'm going to change that and see what happens. That might even be your colleagues that's trying to be a smartass, right? So for that, you need the catch-all route if they actually type something that the application won't recognize. We can easily add a path at the end here. So that's where we want to add it. And it captures every crazy little thing that most likely your colleague and your tester is trying to do to your application. So there. You can go home and feel good about yourself, right? You have a catch-all route, and you're able to render something useful. I saw you. You were trying to do that, right? Just messing with me. So programmatic routing. Programmatic routing is simply your ability to route inside of code, right? Instead of using those router elements. And we have a lot of these scenarios normally, right? We do some interaction with the application, and at some point, by someone clicking some button, you want to make sure that whenever an AJAX operation is done, then maybe you take them to some other nice page. And this is where you want to use programmatic routing. So programmatic routing is just your ability to access the router object and call push. And push simply means redirect to this URL. Very simple. As simple as it should be, I would say. What about viewports? I mean, most routers out there and most routing scenarios are usually quite simple, right? But we do have these cases when it goes crazy. And when it goes crazy and we have nested routes, we want a very capable router. And that's what multiple viewports enables you to have. So you can actually name different viewports. So when you come to a certain page, you can say, for this page, I want to replace even the header, or I want to replace the footer. Not only do I want to replace the middle content that I always replace, but there might be a totally different menu. We've all seen this. So we give it a name. And in this case, we just say path, and we say components. So default is simply that router view viewport that's not named, which is your usual bit that you replace. And then we have a named thing, a footer. So suddenly we say that the footer is different on this page. And this enables you to customize this per route. You feel him? There is more. All right. We need to learn how to test our app. How many here writes tests? It's almost like your manager is in the room, right? No, but seriously, we want a good test experience, right? If you're going to write those tests, we don't want it to be painful. And for that reason, we have a lot of nice libraries for that, and we have a lot of nice tools, hopefully. And Vue is no different, right? It has a lot of very nice approach to testing. What movie is this? Starship Troopers, am I right? There's a bug! Yes, this is the scenario you have, right? You have some painful bug, which means that you can't go home when it's Friday and it's 5 o'clock, and you all deploy on a Friday afternoon, right? Yep. Okay, so the easiest way to get started with testing is to use the Vue-CLI, because all the configuration is up and running, and that's awesome, right? There are different ways of doing testing right now. If you've been living on Twitter like me, you will see that a lot of people right now are saying, we don't like unit testing, they're horrible, and they only test internals, and the internals is going to change. So if you're in that camp, maybe you are going to like end-to-end testing. So end-to-end testing comes with support for both Cypress and Nightwatch. So both of these frameworks have the ability to help you with those kind of external testing, right? We're only testing what we see. If you're the person whose manager, or maybe you, say that, well, I want to unit test everything, then we got Karma, Chai, or Jest for you. Depends on you. So how do we do a unit test? Well, there are some steps to follow, but it's always the same steps. The first thing we do is to get a constructor reference to our component. We instantiate that component, and then we call mount. After we called mount, we try to find our element. Once we found our element, we try to assert on what we're looking at. Okay, there are a few steps. What does he mean? Let's have a look at the test. As I say, the first thing we do here is to get a constructor reference, right? We talk to Vue and say, well, you know this test component that I wrote. Can you give me a constructor? Once I have my constructor, I can just new it up. Once I node it up, I can call mount, and we are kind of ready for business, right? So the last thing you see here is the assertion stage, in which we say, well, I'm going to use the query selector and see if I can find this header with a specific text. If I can find that, it probably renders, right? So what about the component with input props? We're always going to have input props. Imagine that the component looks like this. It has a title, it has some input props, and yeah, we want to be able to create this component with that data, right? We want to be able to emulate the fact that this user is using it for real. And the test here adds an object to the constructor for our object here. So first we get the constructor reference to our component. Once we have that, we can, by populating props data, we can just give it input parameters, right? Whatever parameters we have, here they are, and it gets rendered inside the component. And yes, the assertion state lastly makes sure that everything is rendered correctly. What about events? Of course, we're going to be able to click and interact and do whatever with our components. How do we test that? Well, here we have a component with exactly that scenario, right? It has some kind of clicker, and that thing is pointing to a change method. And once we click the change method, we are going to set this message property. And we want to look for that, right? So what we want to do inside of our test is to mount the component. We want to click the button, and we want to ensure that whatever is rendered now looks OK. So we need to trigger a click event. So the usual business of getting the reference, newing up the component, mounting the component, and the first thing we do here is to try to find the button, right? So our first query selector say, I think you have a button with the class change button. So once I have a reference to the button, I'm able to invoke a click event on that button. Once I'm invoking the click event, I'm able to actually see what happens, right? So I run my query selector and say, I actually expect my text content now to have changed. which is what I'm doing, right? I'm just asserting that whatever happened when I click this button is okay. Okay, let's have a look at Nightwatch. This is just one of two really good flavors. So Nightwatch and Cypress are the two great ones. By the way, Gleb is here today if you want to talk Cypress. He's actually the chief architect. Anyone tried Cypress? You should try Cypress. End-to-end testing is horrible without Cypress. Okay. Google it. You won't be sorry. So, okay, so we have our scenario here. We take our test component. We're doing an end-to-end test. We click the button. So it's not really different from the unit test that we're trying to do. We're just using a different flavor of testing framework. So it looks a bit different. So the first thing we do is to wait for the app to be visible. So we wait like 5 seconds or whatever it takes. Next step is to check that a certain element is present. Then we say, do you contain this text? Yes, I do. Do you have a button? Yes, I do. Once you do that, you can just click that button and you can assert on the result. So this looks very similar to the unit test scenario. It's just a different kind of library of doing this. And to be honest, I think this looks a bit easier to look at. We have a similar scenario here, not quite like the unit test, but instead we try to write to the input field. This is a very common thing we do inside of a component, right? If we have an input field, we try to write to it, and we press some kind of button, and we expect something to be updated. This is a great test, especially if you got some kind of AJAX that happens, right? It hits some kind of endpoint, and that endpoint say, well, send this back, and that thing gets to populate your component. So here we have the same kind of scenario, but we are calling the set value method, and this is us saying, give me a text element, and here's the text that you should contain. And after that, we do assertion and say, well, yeah, okay, you seem to contain what you're supposed to contain. There's a very good book on this topic that's going to go deeper on testing. It's written by a guy called Ed. Has anyone been to a Vue conference? There's a very good conference that goes on in London every year, pretty much, and Ed is usually one of the speakers. He has a very good book on testing with Vue. So, super exciting, right? We love tests. Woohoo! Is this you? I think you're still awake. I must be doing something wrong. Okay. So you're here, probably here to talk about state management, right? I mean, if you're here as Vue developers, you already know all this. It's like yada, yada, yada. Okay, now the good parts. Let's talk about state management and what we do with state management. So state management normally is about data flow, right? It's about having a single source of truth. That's what we're achieving. It's usually where we put all the global data. That's the point of having any kind of Redux pattern. Because what we want is to make sure that the state isn't here, 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 and we don't really know what component is correct. That's why we have it, and that's why we have Vuex. Anyone play this game? Some heads, I think. You're older than me, I think. Okay, so what about the store here? We can easily, as I said before, bring in a script tag, and that script tag is going to give us the store, or Vuex. Once we have that, we are able to instantiate the store, and that's done simply by doing this. So what we give the store initially is the global object that constitutes your state, right? So here you say, I have a property count. The initial value of count is 0. So you can read from it, right? So what we need to do to read from the state and ensure that this actually shows in the component is to set up something called the computed property, and then we can show it through interpolation that we normally do. So here we have this computed property with a method count. And so the count is simply pointing to a function, and the function returns from the store. So we do store.count simply to get this value to show in the template. That's pretty simple stuff. And yeah, we can just show it like this. It works. What about changing it? Mutations. So there are different flavors of changing this, or different levels of indirection. So the simplest one is mutations, and mutations is you mutating the state. So when you invoke one of these mutation methods, what you're actually doing is to update the state somehow, right? Update, create, read, delete, whatever you're trying to do. So we can call a mutation by calling the store's commit method. This is you targeting the mutations property in the store. And so here, down here, you call store commit, right? So when you call increment here, that's the same thing as going to the mutations property, look for the increment method, and let it do its thing. So quickly back. we had the increment method here, right, inside of the store. And to invoke that thing, we just call store commit. Okay, that's great. But we can also commit with the payload. And this is you saying, like, something actually happened. Someone added a product. So here's the product too, right? Because normally you want to provide something to the state. So how do we access the payload in the store? Well, we can so inside of our mutations here, inside of add products, we actually get a parameter in which is called state. And state products is, our state, whereas the payload comes as a second argument here. So when we call the mutation, it's going to hit the right function, and the second argument is the payload. So we're going to be able to say, payload, try to persist you inside of the state. Actions. Now I'm talking about different levels of indirection, because we can be fine with just mutations, but there is such a thing called actions. So actions are simply one level up. And the reason for using those is usually asynchronous scenarios when things take time. Let's have a look at that. So we defined something called actions as well, right? So we have mutations, but we also have actions. So if we use an action, this usually means that we have an asynchronous scenario. It takes a few seconds to persist this against the backend. We get some response back. So once we're done, we're calling context commit, right? So we're not talking to the store directly here, but indirectly. So we call context commit after this has been doing its thing for X number of seconds. So calling it from a component would look something like this. So we call store dispatch. So this might look a bit confusing, right? Because I'm calling the action the same thing as the mutation. But this dispatch here is actually calling the action. And if the action takes a few seconds to finish, once it's done, then we can just call commit on the store itself, right? And we go back to that state mutation stage. So actions is just another level. Okay, so the asynchronous scenario usually looks like this with any kind of async, right? You want to set some loading state to true, you want to fetch the data. When the data comes back, you either want to set the data itself or you want to set it to an error because, the network is down or whatever. And yes, when you're done, that spinner should be hidden. So you have this scenario. You do load products, you call this commit that's going to set our loading state, and then you do some kind of get products from the API. And once you're done with this async await, you get the actual data and you call commit with the actual products. And if something goes really, really wrong, it's going to happen in the catch. And in the catch, we call the commit with the error instead. So our state can be overcrowded. Our state can actually be a ton of properties. Could be 20, 25 properties, and you start to lose control. So at that point, we can actually split it up in different store modules. But the store modules is really just looking like a normal store. It's just that they're like child modules inside of yours. So let's say, for example, you got some product state over here and some user state over there. If you want to split it and make it easier for you or some other developer in a big project, this is an approach you could be using. And those child modules are simply like a normal store. So here we just create them just like this with a state and mutations and actions, right? You just need to make sure that there is a root store, right? That mentions these child stores. And that's actually all I got. So this was a ton of information about Vue.js, all the way from basic hello world to Vuex. I will provide you with all the slides, so you can read this at probably quarter speed. So I covered components, I covered routing, I covered testing, and even Vuex. And yes, further reading, official documentation, I cannot give this one enough praise. This is very, very good. The rest of the core team is worth following, and they are mentioned here at this page. And yeah, they're awesome on Twitter and can give you a lot of tips. And yes, so this is all I had. Thank you very much for listening, and really appreciate it.